I want you to picture the way we normally talk about the divine. Because if you grew up in or, around any kind of Western tradition, there is this almost inescapable architecture to it.
Right, yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah, you walk through the doors of theology and you're immediately standing inside this big courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
There's a judge looking down from a high bench, there's a heavy wooden gavel, and there's a very strict, uncompromising set of laws you're expected to follow.
It's very transactional.
Exactly. It's clean, it's binary, you either broke the rule or you kept the rule. But what happens if you walk into that same room and the judge's bench is completely gone, the gavel is missing, and instead of a courtroom, you realize you're actually standing at a wedding altar?
I mean, it completely shatters the paradigm, doesn't it? You're forced to move away from this legal framework of debts and credits, and you have to navigate something that's entirely relational, something that requires vulnerability rather than, just compliance.
And that profound shift is exactly what we are exploring in today's deep dive. We're going to take you on this highly tailored journey through a really unconventional theological framework.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. We've been combing through a massive stack of materials from a ministry called Jesus Raw. And this includes a series of website excerpts, a really deeply detailed audio transcript from a speaker who goes by Papa Scouts, and a summary document that focuses on redefining spiritual warfare.
And our mission today is to unpack all of that, to understand their core premise, which demands that you strip away centuries of religious noise, tradition, expectation. Because their argument here is that Jesus didn't come to start a religion. He came to break chains.
Right.
And to understand that, you have to view God not as a lawyer looking for an indictment, but as a lover looking for a connection.
Now, before we get completely lost in this, it's definitely worth pointing out that these sources do not pull their punches.
No, they really don't.
Not at all. As we unpack this material, you're going to find that they make some highly charged political and social statements. For instance, the speaker makes a point about hating the Communist Party of China while deeply loving the Chinese people.
Yeah, that's explicitly in there.
Right. And there's a claim that Jesus actively hated the ruling government of his day. And they also offer some very heavy, direct critiques of specific religious denominations, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses. So as your guides on this deep dive, we have to clarify that our job isn't to endorse or defend or even debate those specific political or religious views.
Absolutely. We aren't taking any sides here.
Right. We're simply here to extract the underlying logic, the spiritual architecture contained in these original sources.
Exactly. We're looking at the mechanism of their argument. And to really grasp why this framework so aggressively rejects traditional religion, we have to start right where they start, by completely redefining a word that you probably hear all the time. The word is faith. The sources make this rather bold, counterintuitive claim that faith has absolutely nothing to do with believing.
Which, if you spent any time in a pew, that sounds like straight up heresy, right?
Oh, totally.
Because the entire system is built on intellectual belief. You believe the right things, you check the right doctrinal boxes, and you're secure. So how do the sources justify just throwing that out?
Well, they go straight to the linguistic root. They break down the original Greek word for faith used in the New Testament, which is pistio. Traditional systems have usually translated this as, intellectual agreement.
Right.
But the speaker points out a massive logical flaw in that translation. Because Satan and his fallen angels believe in God. They know for a fact God exists.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. Adam and Eve believed in God when they were standing right there in the garden talking to him. Belief wasn't their problem. Having the correct facts didn't save them.
Right, because their problem was a refusal to actually surrender to that reality. They had the data, but they just wouldn't yield.
Precisely. So the text argues that pisteo is vastly misunderstood. It shouldn't be translated as believing, but rather as allowing yourself to be persuaded.
Allowing yourself to be persuaded.
Yeah. Think about the difference there. Persuasion is an active yielding. It's about letting divine love quench the fire of your own human rebellion and stubbornness. It requires you to drop your guard.
So it's not about God handing you a contract to sign. It's about God alluring you. One of the quotes in the material that really stuck out to me just flatly asks, what if you just let God love you for a change?
And if you apply that lens, that God is a lover trying to persuade humanity, it completely reshapes how you read the text of the Bible.
How so?
Well, the sources argue it isn't a rule book at all. It's fundamentally a romance. It starts in Genesis with the marriage of heaven and earth, framing heaven as masculine and earth as feminine.
Oh, I see.
And then it moves through the union of Adam and Eve, the relationship between Israel and Jehovah, Christ and his bride, and it culminates at the very end of the book of Revelation with the marriage supper of the Lamb. The end game isn't a verdict. It's a divine union.
Wait, I'm struggling with this persuasion idea a little bit. If God is just waiting for us to yield, to say yes, and to just let him love us, that sounds incredibly passive.
Right.
I mean, if faith is just allowing yourself to be persuaded, how does that completely dismantle the traditional religious posture of trying to earn forgiveness through sacrifice? Like, traditional religion uses strict rules to manage darkness. If you take away the rules, how does this framework not just collapse into total chaos?
That tension is exactly why the sources launch into such a fierce deconstruction of organized religion. If God is a lover trying to persuade you, then a system based on fear, rigid doctrine, and earning your keep isn't just misguided. It's actually the ultimate insult to that love.
Because you can't earn love.
Exactly. Persuasion inherently requires free will and authentic vulnerability. Earning requires a ledger. Religion, the text argues, tries to manage evil through control, which completely blocks the vulnerability needed for true persuasion to happen in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't force someone to fall in love with you at gunpoint or, under the threat of a cosmic courtroom sentence.
No, you really can't.
Which explains why the sources lean so heavily into what the speaker calls biblical realism, because they argue that the Bible actually goes out of its way to show you that trying to manage human behavior through perfection is just a fool's errand.
Yeah, the audio transcript focuses heavily on this. It points out that the Bible is not a pleasant, sanitized, moralistic book. It's this book of gritty realism that constantly exposes the profound flaws of his greatest heroes.
Like David, right.
Yeah, take King David. The text notes that God basically shows everyone his dirty underwear. He was a murderer, he was an adulterer, and yet he's called a man after God's own heart. Or look at King Hezekiah.
All right, there's a specific, really chilling moment the speaker highlights regarding Hezekiah from 2 Chronicles 32. It says that in a critical moment, God actually left Hezekiah alone.
Yeah.
And the speaker makes this profound observation. He says, God won't forsake you, but he will leave you to your own devices sometimes. He will step back just to see what is actually in your heart, to let you experience the absolute failure of your own stubborn, self-reliant thinking.
And experiencing that failure is the necessary precursor to persuasion. You have to realize your rules can't save you.
Right.
And because of this intense focus on love and realism, the sources make a massive theological pivot here. They launch a total rejection of the doctrine of hell.
Yeah, they do not mince words here at all. They dismantle the traditional view of eternal torment completely.
The logical argument the speaker makes is pretty devastating to the traditional model. He asks, how could a God who is all-knowing, who knows the end from the beginning, intentionally create a world where 90% of humanity who the text notes are not believers are destined to be tortured with fire for eternity?
It's a heavy question.
It is. The speaker argues that eternal conscious torment would require God to actively enact a miracle of pain. He would have to continuously supply these souls with the supernatural endurance just to keep them alive so he could keep torturing them.
Wow.
And the argument is that a lover simply could not and would not ever do this. It violates the entire core premise of persuasion.
Now, if you grew up in a traditional religious setting where hell is the primary motivator for getting saved, hearing this might make you want to pause and check your Bible.
Oh, definitely.
But the sources actually back this up with a really fascinating historical and textual observation about the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, this is where it gets highly analytical. The source claims that Paul, the guy who wrote the vast majority of Christian theology for the early church, from the book of Romans all the way through his epistles, never once mentions hell.
Wait, really? Not once?
Not once. Nor does he mention tithing, by the way. And the argument here is simple. If eternal conscious torment was the absolute cornerstone of the new theology, the ultimate consequence of not having faith, wouldn't the primary architect of early Christian doctrine have mentioned it at least once?
That is a staggering point. So if there is no hell acting as the ultimate stick, and there are no rigid laws acting as the ultimate ledger, what is the actual mechanism for interacting with God? Like, how does the divine actually interface with a flawed human being?
Well, the sources point to the conscience. And the linguistic breakdown they provide for that word is just brilliant.
Let's hear it.
They look at the Greek word for conscience, which is synodesis, and it literally translates to see together with.
To see together with. So your conscience isn't just, Jiminy Cricket sitting on your shoulder making you feel guilty. It is quite literally the space inside you where you and God perceive reality together.
Precisely. The text argues that the conscience is the amalgamation of the human will, emotion, and brain, plus one specific part of the spirit that God left intact in every single human being so that he could redeem it.
Interesting.
It's the receptor for persuasion. But, and here is the core of their critique against organized systems, the speaker argues that religion absolutely ruins the conscience.
Okay, but how exactly does it ruin it? What's the psychological mechanism there?
Because religion substitutes authentic connection for artificial superiority.
Right.
It elevates its specific doctrines, its polished speakers, and its theatrical services above that simple, quiet space of seeing together with.
Right.
The source specifically points out groups like Jehovah's Witnesses here to illustrate the point. The argument is that when a group believes their strict adherence to a specific doctrine makes them inherently closer to God than anyone else, they develop this sense of spiritual superiority.
And that messes with the conscience.
Yeah, because that superiority literally hardens their hearts. It makes them cold, rigid, and completely unable to be persuaded by love because they already think they have all the answers.
They highlight this dynamic by bringing up Romans chapter 2, verse 14, looking at the ancient, deeply entrenched division between Jews and Gentiles.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Right, because in the ancient world, the circumcised Jews had the law, they had the history of miracles, they had the entire religious system. The Gentiles had none of that. But the text argues that God gave the religious system to the Israelites as a massive test case of failure, basically to definitively prove that no amount of law, no matter how perfectly handed down, can actually make a human being close to God.
Right, because Paul points out that when uncircumcised Gentiles, who don't even know the law, naturally do what the law requires just by following their hearts, it proves the law is already written on their conscience.
Right.
They are seeing together with God naturally, without any of the religious machinery.
The speaker says trying to use scripture to argue with heavily indoctrinated people is like playing chess with yourself to heal your own depression.
I love that analogy.
It's so good. It's a completely closed loop where the rules of the game prevent any actual healing, and you're just moving pieces around a board of your own vanity.
That is exactly the trap the sources describe, which forces a massive reconstruction. Because if you strip away all the traditional mechanics, no courtroom, no hell, no legalistic chess games, how did these sources rebuild humanity's relationship with God from the ground up?
They go all the way back to the deep mysteries of creation and biology. They look at the very blueprint of how things were made.
And they start by drawing a really stark contrast between angels and mankind.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
The speaker points out a structural detail. Angels were not made in pairs. There is no male or female among the angelic host. They are singular, powerful, fully realized spiritual beings. And because they were made this way, standing alone in their perfection, the text argues that they became consumed by vanity. They became obsessed with their own power, their own position, and their complete lack of need for anyone else.
Yeah.
That isolation and perfection is what led to their fall.
But mankind was designed with a completely different architecture. We were uniquely made as male and female. And there is a major specific theological point raised about how Eve was created.
Right.
She was not formed from scratch out of the dirt the way Adam was. The Hebrew text is very specific that she was taken from Adam's side.
Which implies they are fundamentally one flesh. One complete identity separated into two distinct persons so that they could actually experience a relationship. They were designed for union, not isolation. Now, the sources take this biological blueprint of Adam and Eve and they map it directly onto the divine relationship between Jesus and the Father.
Right. They use this origin story to refute specific religious doctrines that claim Jesus was just some highly exalted, created being. The speaker argues really emphatically that Jesus was not created. Just like Eve, he was taken from the Father, meaning they share the exact same essence. They are one spirit.
And the sources rely heavily on the wave-particle duality in quantum physics to explain this divine union.
Bringing science into it.
Yeah, you have a phenomenon that behaves as both a wave and a particle, depending on how it's observed, yet it remains fundamentally one thing. It's two distinct expressions of a single intrinsic reality. In theological terms, this is the word becoming flesh.
The way they dive into the linguistic roots of Genesis to explain this just blew my mind. When God says, let us make man in our image after our likeness, we usually just read those as synonyms. But the sources break down the Hebrew words, and they are vastly different.
They really are. The Hebrew word for image is Betzelem, and the source defines this as meaning a spirit, a phantom, or a ghost.
Phantom.
Yeah, that is the divine image, the invisible, immaterial essence. But the word for likeness is kidmutnu. The text notes that the root of this word begins with a letter that represents the palm of a hand.
So it carries this incredibly visceral meaning of being scooped up in the palms of the hands, formed in blood and air. We are the Betzelem, the phantom spirit, housed inside the kidmutnu, the scooped up dust, blood, and breath, the invisible and the physical perfectly unified.
Which just brings a whole new depth to the idea of a divine marriage.
Speaking of that marriage, the audio transcript throws out a theological riddle that I want to run by you.
Okay, let's hear it.
So if the church is married to Jesus, as the New Testament says, and Israel was married to Jehovah in the Old Testament, the source points out this would mean two husbands, unless Jesus and the Father are exactly the same person. So how does that two husbands riddle completely reframe the way we view the divine family tree?
It forces a total collapse of the rigid hierarchical trinity that you often find in systematic theology. It demands that you view God the Father and Jesus not as a boss and an employee,
Right.
or a creator and a subordinate creation. You have to view them as that wave and particle, one single, undivided divine identity expressing itself in a way that can marry humanity. If there's only one continuous love story, there can only be one husband.
Okay, so if this is true, if humanity is designed for this profound, intimate divine marriage where we are scooped into the hands of God to share his exact spirit, we have to ask the elephant in the room.
Why are we such a mess?
Yes, why are we such a complete mess? Why are we so deeply flawed, so weak, and so prone to rebellion? If we're designed for union, why are we built with so much vulnerability?
And this brings us to the most surprising paradigm shift in the entire deep dive. The sources argue that our weakness is not a bug in the system, is not an accident. It's actually the exact weapon God uses to defeat evil.
They introduce this through an incredible concept called counting coup.
Yes, the counting coup.
And just as a quick piece of context here, the source mentions a historical belief that Native Americans are actually the 13th tribe of Israel, and therefore they carry these deep, ancient spiritual archetypes within their culture. And one of those sacred traditions is the practice of counting coup.
Right. And in the tradition of counting coup, a valiant warrior doesn't achieve ultimate glory by slaughtering his enemy on the battlefield.
Which is what you'd expect.
Right. But killing is viewed as almost too easy, too transactional. Instead, the warrior uses incredible stealth, craft, and skill to get close enough to his enemy to simply touch them with a stick or a small piece of wood.
And then they just walk away. They don't strike a lethal blow.
Exactly, because touching them and walking away completely humiliates and eviscerates the enemy psychologically. It proves to the enemy and to everyone watching, I was close enough to take your life. You were completely at my mercy, but I spared you for the sake of the coup.
Wow.
It is the ultimate display of absolute superiority demonstrated through total restraint.
And the sources apply this psychological devastation directly to the cross of Christ. The cross, they argue, is the ultimate stick of wood. The argument is that Satan and the dark principalities weren't just defeated at the crucifixion, they were touched with the stick. They were completely and utterly humiliated.
The transcript quotes 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8 to back this up. That verse says that if the dark forces and the rulers of this age had truly understood what was happening, they never would have crucified the Lord of glory.
Because they thought they were winning.
They thought they were winning the chess game. They thought executing Jesus was their ultimate victory. But by willingly getting them to execute him on a wooden cross, God touched them with the stick. He allowed them to exert their maximum lethal force only to absorb it and walk away. It was their spiritual ruin.
There is actually a massive foreshadowing of this in the Old Testament that the source brings up. When David is being hunted by King Saul and Saul is actively trying to murder him, David sneaks into a cave where Saul happens to be sleeping.
Right, he has him cornered.
David has the absolute advantage. His men are begging him to just kill Saul and end the war. But instead, David just takes his sword and cuts off a small piece of Saul's robe.
It is a classic textbook counting coup move. David chooses divine principle over circumstantial opportunity. He proves his absolute power over his enemy through restraint, completely humiliating Saul's vanity in the process.
So how does this translate to our everyday flaws? Because the speaker makes this really raw, kind of humorous point. God intentionally uses weak, flawed humans who, as the source puts it, smell bad, need underarm deodorant, and are basically weaklings to defeat these vain, incredibly powerful, angelic beings.
You have to go back to why the angels fell. They fell through vanity. They were obsessed with their own unblemished perfection and their own solitary power. So, in response, God creates a race formed from the dirt. A race that is inherently prone to failure, sickness, and weakness, yet still capable of choosing love. When a weak, flawed human being, sitting in the middle of their own mess, chooses to surrender and love God despite their suffering, it acts as a counting coup against the fallen angels. It completely humiliates their vanity.
The source mentions the Apostle Paul's famous thorn in the flesh to illustrate this. Paul begged God 3 separate times to take away this immense suffering he was enduring, and God flat out said no.
But not because God is cruel.
Right. The text argues God said no because he didn't want Paul to become so perfect and powerful that he fell victim to the exact same sin of vanity that destroyed Satan. The weakness was a shield. So humanity's very powerlessness, the reality of our flaws that Job and Paul had to face, is actually the ultimate stick used to humiliate the vanity of fallen angels. That flips the entire script on what it means to be spiritually strong.
It completely redefines strength as surrender. It redefines victory as a total reliance on grace, rather than an arrogant display of moral perfection.
Which is the perfect place to pull all of this together for you, the listener. Think about the ground we've covered today. We started by walking out of that rigid, transactional, religious courtroom and stepping up to the wedding altar, learning to see God as a lover whose only goal is to persuade us to yield.
Yeah.
We moved past the paralyzing need for religious legalism and superiority, embracing the gritty realism of our own flawed human nature. We explored the deep biological mysteries of creation, realizing we are the phantom spirit housed in blood and breath, designed to be one with the divine.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It really is. And finally, we saw the cross not just as a sacrifice, but as the ultimate counting coup. The profound humiliation of evil through weakness, restraint, and a stick of wood.
And the reason this matters so deeply to you is because it completely transforms how you are allowed to view your own weaknesses. Rather than seeing your flaws as shameful liabilities that you need to hide behind a mask of religious rules, you can see them for what they are. Your flaws, your struggles, and your conscience. That quiet space where you see reality together with God. Those are the exact spaces where grace and true persuasion are able to happen. Your weakness isn't your downfall. It's the weapon God uses.
Before we sign off today, I want to leave you with one final thought to really mull over.
Yeah, if true power and ultimate victory are demonstrated not by obliterating an opponent, but by touching them with a stick and showing immense restraint through the counting coup, how might that profoundly change the way you confront the everyday enemies, the conflicts, or the obstacles in your own life? What if your greatest victory isn't found in destroying who you're fighting, but simply getting close enough to them to show grace?
I love that. A completely different way to win the battle. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible exploration of these sources. The courtroom is officially closed and the ledger has been thrown out. Until next time, keep diving deep.